Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Global Realignment Podcast. Thank you for joining me today. We have two stories that we're going to be covering. The first is related to the Congo and their natural resources. And I know that's an exciting topic. I made a video on that a couple of weeks ago, and it was extraordinarily popular. You should take a look at it if you have an opportunity to do so. But Felix Tshisekedi, the Congolese president, sent a proposal to the Trump administration. The proposal was basically laying out an idea that the U.S. would help the Congolese militia army push out the M23 militia that has been ravaging the eastern part of Congo in exchange for U.S. access to eastern Congo's rare earth minerals and natural resources. So that's a pretty interesting thing, and I'm sure that there's some excitement going on right now within the Trump administration, because in that previous video I did on Congo, I said that Trump was definitely interested in Eastern Congo's natural resources and rare earths. The second story, Trump is also interested in securing Ukraine's critical infrastructure, particularly their nuclear power plants. Zelensky and Trump had a phone call a couple days ago where they were discussing the ceasefire that we discussed in another video. And Zelensky gave a statement after that, and he said that Trump was interested specifically in helping the Ukrainians secure, in the long term, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Zaporozhye is an oblast or region in the southeastern part of Ukraine. And that particular nuclear power plant is actually under Russian control presently. The Russians control, I would say, probably about half of Zaporozhye right now. It is one of the oblasts that Putin annexed. And so it would be interesting to me to see how Trump would plan on securing this particular kind of infrastructure in Ukraine. And as I've repeated many times before, I'm not sure where this interest is coming from for Trump to get involved economically in these war-torn countries. And I do understand this critical need that we have for rare earth resources and minerals so that we can diversify our supply chains from China. But Congo is in the middle of a war that's actually getting worse. Ukraine is in the middle of a war. And the prospect of either one of these wars ending anytime soon are very slim, regardless of what you might hear from the media. So if we are able to secure a deal like this with the Congo, specifically with the Congo, this would likely involve U.S. troops in order to rout the M23 rebels that allegedly have Rwanda's regular military backing them. That would call for troops on the ground, which I strongly doubt would happen. The same thing would go for securing these power plants in Ukraine and their critical infrastructure. That's not a job that civilians can do right now in Ukraine. That would be a job for either a military, peacekeepers, or a private military organization, none of which would be allowed by the Russians at this time, absent some kind of ceasefire or peace treaty. But even then, that is one of the red lines that the Russians have. Demilitarized Ukraine. Another red line, no foreign troops on the soil, no peacekeepers. So we'll see what happens. But I don't believe that any of these endeavors will be successful, frankly. I think that on paper, they may work out. I do believe that Ukrainian President Zelensky and Trump will one day sit down and sign a mineral deal, maybe an infrastructure deal. Perhaps Marco Rubio might go to Congo and sign some kind of treaty or piece of paper with Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi. But I think that signing those pieces of papers will be largely theater, and it won't probably go any further than that. It will be an opportunity for Trump to claim a victory, his base to claim a win, and that'll basically be it. As for the idea of moving forward with extracting these resources or guarding the infrastructure of Ukraine, I don't know that we would actually see anything like that within the lifetime of Trump's presidency. But we shall see. And the unfortunate part about both of these proposals, particularly I would add the proposal in Congo, is that I don't honestly believe that the revenues, if these projects were to get off the ground, if we signed a treaty with Congo, and if projects for mining got off the ground, I don't believe that much of the revenues would go to the natives in Congo. We're talking about an impoverished third world country, and I would argue that most of the revenues would either go to their corrupt government or back to the US, the firms and the investors that invest in these projects. Very little of it would trickle down to the natives in this country, which is unfortunate. And I would say the same thing in terms of Ukraine signing a mineral deal with the US. Much of that country right now is basically a rump state. And so if in the future these projects got off the ground and US firms started to extract rare earths and natural resources from Ukraine, I'd wonder how beneficial it would be to the actual inhabitants there, especially when you consider that many of these inhabitants have lost family members. Ukrainian inhabitants have lost family members in the war. And so that's an unfortunate component to look at. As many of you may know, China has been in the Congo for quite some time, extracting their natural resources in the eastern part of Congo, working in conjunction with local authorities and their government in Kinshasa. And so the country still remains a third world. There's a third world country. There's a lot of corruption involved in the Chinese businesses that are over in Congo working with their government. And again, native population is not benefiting. Now, again, the military will be needed in any one of these endeavors in one way or the other. And as many of you know, natural resources have played a significant part of Trump's administration, particularly in his dealings with Venezuela. Obviously, as we just discussed, Ukraine, Russia, Congo, of course, and Greenland. Basically, any way for us to move our supply chains for rare earths away from China. And if you don't know already, Putin has actually made an offer to Trump. I think it was during their first conversation that, in the future, the US and the Russians can work together, exploiting their vast reserves of rare earths and natural resources. So something to keep in mind. Trump did invoke wartime powers to increase US mineral production, particularly, again, in the US. This is from the Financial Times. Donald Trump has invoked wartime powers as part of a sweeping effort to increase American minerals production and curb the country's reliance on China for critical resources. The president signed an executive order on Thursday directing the use of the Defense Production Act to mobilize industry and expand domestic mineral output on national security grounds. Obviously, our national security, our weapons production depends on these natural resources and rare earths. The order also instructs the government to streamline production permitting and provide loans to boost the domestic mining industry. Thursday's order directs federal agencies to compile a list of projects awaiting approvals in order to expedite their review and advancement, according to a White House official. It will also allow them to prioritize federal lands for mining over other uses and to provide loans for new projects through the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. And so that's a positive thing, right? Without sounding like a tree hugger, I would hope that, any kind of exploration that we do in the U.S. or any kind of mining would be done safely and within the reasonable regulatory boundaries, because the environment's important. And I will also say that it's a positive thing, exploiting our own resources instead of pursuing these resources in war-torn third world countries where the investment to the U.S. itself would be tremendous. And I don't know if, again, the revenues would be benefit to the U.S. as much as it would be the individual investors and mining firms that would be exploiting those resources. And of course, the host governments of those countries. Now, digging into the Congo situation, this is from the Journal. In a February 8th letter to Trump, Felix Tshisekedi offered mining opportunities for the U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund, an entity Trump had launched a few days earlier. And this is just to give you an idea of a few of the minerals and rare and resources the U.S. is interested in in the eastern part of Congo. Coltan, which tantalum is extracted from, cobalt, lithium, diamonds, gold, and the various rare earths that the U.S. is interested in. I think there's like a list of like 15 of them that we're not going to get into. Last year, Elon Musk of Tesla called lithium the new oil, largely because he uses lithium for his car batteries. And so there's also that component that creates interest within the Trump administration for these resources. Trump, if you didn't know, was pushed past the finish line by some very powerful tech oligarchs from Silicon Valley, or what many call little tech. So they helped push him past the finish line in 2024 relative to the presidential election. And this would be something that would be genuinely beneficial to them, having access to these resources and not having to go through China. In exchange, the article continues, Tshisekedi asked Trump for a formal security pact to help his army defeat M23, an allegedly backed Rwandan rebel group that's ravaging the eastern part of Congo right now, including Congolese soldiers, UN troops, and private mercenaries. And they're pushing further to the west. They just captured another key city, I think yesterday. I forgot the name of it. The offer comes at the same time Tshisekedi is in negotiations with Eric Prince, who founded a private military company then called Blackwater. Prince would help the Congolese government collect and secure taxes from mining operations, according to Congolese and Western officials. If you don't know who Eric Prince is, he's basically he was basically a privateer in the War on Terror. And he ran the company Blackwater, and he racked up millions in U.S. government security contracts and soldiers of fortune to the CIA, Pentagon, and beyond, particularly in Iraq. 2 books were written on Blackwater, one by Eric Prince called Civilian Warriors, which is a good book. The other one I didn't read. It's by Jeremy Scahill, I believe, and I think it's called Blackwater. And I guess it's, a more critical book of a more critical look at Blackwater and Eric Prince. But he's been in Trump circles lately, and he's been particularly talking about privatizing the deportation of immigrants. And so he's somebody that I've been kind of following. He is a former Navy SEAL. After the administration, and this is kind of going back to the article though, after the administration received the offer, the Treasury Department unveiled sanctions against Rwanda's Minister of State for Regional Integration, James Kabarebe, and M23 spokesman Lawrence Kanyuka Kingston over their involvement in the Congo conflict. So they get this letter, this proposal from Tshisekedi, the president of Congo, and afterwards they're sanctioning officials within the Rwandan state apparatus, who again the U.S. alleges are backing the M23 rebels in the eastern part of Congo. So very interesting stuff. Kind of looks like we're seeing where the battle lines are being drawn. People are taking their sides. So it's something we'll be paying attention to. I don't know that there's going to be, the coverage isn't too wide on this often, but definitely something to be paying attention to see where that goes. Now, related to this issue about Trump acquiring Ukraine's utilities, very quickly we'll run through this. President Trump raised the possibility, this is from the Journal, that the U.S. would acquire Ukrainian power plants, including nuclear facilities, and he called the idea the best protection for that infrastructure, as the White House tries to jumpstart talks to halt the Ukraine-Russia war. And of course, I didn't cover this. There wasn't really much to cover, but there were 2 phone calls this week, important phone calls, one between President Trump and Putin. I think it lasted about 2 hours, and the other between Trump and Zelensky afterwards, and they were discussing the ceasefire proposal from last week. And we know that was like, let me see here. It was basically a ceasefire proposal that gave the Russians nothing, And so obviously Putin rejected it. The Russians have always been in favor of a negotiated peace, but it won't be one that's as written by the Trump's envoys over there, Waltz and company. So they're continuing to work on it. But they did, there was some success with this meeting. They managed to establish a 30-day period where the bombing on both sides would stop on critical infrastructure, right? Trump obviously took a victory lap, but the bombing resumed almost immediately. Both sides ended up bombing critical infrastructure in their respective countries, and of course blaming the other. So they got off to a rocky start. I don't think that that the ceasefire is broken or anything, but it's still happening. In fact, I think it happened today at I think it was an oil depot in Russia, or in Kursk. In Kursk. Kursk is the region that the Ukrainians were recently pushed out of in Russia, in the northern their northern border. And so I believe it was an oil depot that was bombed today by Ukrainian drones. So we'll see how it holds up. But going on with the story, the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure, according to the administration statement. Again, I don't know how they would do this. It would be so interesting for me to see, when they put this down on paper, and they walk us through how they would do this. I don't know how it could not involve troops. And obviously this is a red line that the Russians aren't going to allow something like that. Now, the positive thing is that if you've been following the war for a while, it's usually around the springtime that the infrastructure bombing itself stops. When it comes to the power plants and their Ukraine's the grid and all of these different plants that the Russians usually bomb, that cuts out Ukraine's power and all of these different things. That usually happens in the wintertime, but there's a lull between spring, summer, and fall from that happening. So you call it a victory if you want to from the Trump side, but it's not much of a victory at all, actually. This ceasefire. So Zelensky, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, said on Wednesday the only discussion of potential investment into power facilities with Trump was related to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is idled in Russia, again, occupied territory. And I think that Trump is probably doing this because he is against the idea of Putin obtaining full control of the 4 oblasts. As I mentioned in another video, these oblasts like Zaporozhye are not completely taken by the Russians, right? But Putin, in any negotiated settlement, is going to want to take over the annexed territories that the Russians annexed all the way to their administrative borders, which haven't been taken militarily yet. And so I would think that this is probably a way of Trump kind of, throwing a wrench in that idea and saying, well, we're going to control and operate these plants, right? So you need to it's almost like he's saying he's trying to push Putin away from the idea of demanding complete control up to the administrative borders of the oblasts. So just a thought there. Article continues. Trump asked if the U.S. could invest in and refurbish it, and Zelensky said he wasn't against the idea. Ukraine operates 15 nuclear reactors in 4 nuclear power plants across the country. Russian forces seized the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, Europe's largest, soon after Moscow's invasion in 2022. Now near the front lines, it has been the target of repeated attacks. Before the war, Zaporozhye produced about 20% of Ukraine's power supply. It is largely in shutdown mode now, but Russia has told the IAEA that it plans to reopen the site eventually and might use it to provide occupied areas of Ukraine with electricity. And again, I think this is just another backdoor way the Trump administration is looking for to facilitate some kind of security guarantees for the Ukrainians, right? We can go back to the mineral deal and we can say, well, Trump was implicitly saying with the mineral deal, this is like a security backing. Or we won't have troops, but we'll have personnel working on mining. Okay. And we support the idea of European peacekeepers over here. And the Russians aren't going to try to do anything funny when you have American firms and mining operators working in the country. So security guarantee, basically, which the Russians would reject. Same thing with this idea of, refurbishing and investing in Ukraine's, mineral infrastructure, their power infrastructure. What would that, again, you have American personnel over there. They become a target, an implicit security guarantee for the Ukrainians, essentially. And so I think that's where this idea is coming from of the Trump administration in the U.S. basically taking over and refurbishing these utility infrastructure in Ukraine. However, there is no way, and we know that firms are not going to be interested in exploiting these opportunities, whether it be the mineral deal or this infrastructure situation, without peacekeepers, which again crosses a Russian red line. And honestly, it just kind of goes to show what I've always believed. Trump has always supported Ukraine. There are reasons that we can get into in another video for that. He's always supported them. He's always supported them, staying armed, continuing to arm them, providing these security guarantees. Maybe not the kind of security guarantees that they want him to provide, but security guarantees nonetheless are there in many of these negotiations beyond any ceasefire or treaty between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The U.S. will always be there, and Trump supports that. So don't be fooled by the double talk when he's talking trash about Zelensky and all this other stuff and praising Putin. He's basically looking to, it's a continuation policy from the Biden administration in his approach to the Ukraine situation. Always remember that. That's it for me today. Hope you guys join me the next time. Hit the like button and enjoy your weekends.